Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar video. In this one I want to talk about how I feel they are going to approach doing Book 2 Earth in the Netflix live action adaptation. So if you watched my live stream from a couple of weeks back, you'll note I went over this topic, but of course it's a pretty long live stream, so I did want to eventually make a video version of kind of effectively how I came to those kind of conclusions, and that's what we're going to do here. So before we get into Book 2, I do just want to highlight again, just really quickly going over how did they actually approach adapting Book 1? What is the result after Book 1? So let's go through the episodes. So of course, Season 1, 8 episodes. In the first episode, we basically got episode 1, 2, and 3 of the original series, but of course it's more like half, or at least the main scene from 3. They didn't do all of it, but notably it had an entire 20-minute long whole backstory sequence about Sozan's Comet and the Air Nomad genocide. So that was a major change that they did here. Episode 2 of Netflix Avatar was basically 104, the Warriors of Kyoshi, but they also included the Fire Nation side of 103 in a slightly different way, where it was the introduction of Zhao, but we didn't do everything in exactly the same way. And we had Zhao actually come to Kyoshi. And then it was obviously helped by the fact that they knew more about Kyoshi, so we could go into more in-depth on that. But overall, this is an interesting episode because they actually just let this one breathe. It's not trying to cram too much stuff into one episode, so interesting. Episode 3 of Netflix Avatar is where we start to get into some of the bigger changes. So this one ends up basically being 110 Jet and 117 the Northern Air Temple, basically in the setting of 105, which is Omashu. And then obviously there's new stuff in here, but it's not really just yet the plot of the King of Omashu. That's the second kind of part of what we do here. So this is one of the more enforced changes of they couldn't have that many kind of completely separate episodes where we're here, now we're here. So they had to put a bunch of stuff together into Omashu, which overall was, I think, probably the correct choice to make to create more of an importance on Omashu. But did it all work together? Did it fully hit Jet and the Northern Air Temple as much as it needed to? Given that they were also skipping over other stuff, that's kind of part of the problem here. Episode 4 is more directly, of course, 105, because we're actually introduced to Boomy properly here, and that's kind of what we're about. We still have elements of Jet and the Northern Air Temple in here, but then oddly, we bring up a Season 2 episode, Cave of Two Lovers, pretty much exactly here, just with different characters. And I got the impression most people, while Chong and the Nomads and some of it was pretty accurate, it was just, I think, badly placed. It didn't need to be here. And then there's also a bit of 107 with the Irozuko plot and the Earthbender. So you can see a lot of, for some of these ones where they're not really sure exactly how to do the middle episodes, there's a bit of a scramble to put everything together. Episode 5 of Netflix Avatar is basically 107, quite heavily expanded with kind of more up-to-date kind of lore understanding of the Avatar world. We actually go to the spirit world, which allows us to do a little bit more. So we kind of lose some of the Heibai focus, but we get introduced to kind of more elements. And through the backstories, we get bits of Bado of the Water Tribe, Wan Shi Tong's in here from the library, Ko is in here, and there's even some comic kind of novel stuff that kind of gets referenced a little bit in this as well. So lots of stuff coming together to make up these episodes in the middle of the book. 106 is somewhat similar, but it's a bit more focused as one of the better episodes. So obviously it's primarily meant to be 108, but then it also has the Blue Spirit in here, and then on the Zuko side of things you have the Storm flashbacks, of course. Along with the fact that it's a two-parter with this episode, so you still have elements of 107, 115 for June and stuff like that. The 7th episode, of course, is pretty much just 118, just with some slight expansion. But then they end up cutting certain sections of 118 as well, so it's a bit of an odd one where they give this one a lot of time to just be itself, but it is one of the shorter episodes, so That's a bit of an interesting one. And then the finale is pretty much just allowed to be 119, 120 with the typical expansion and additions you would expect from what they did here, including like having like Azula scenes and Ozai scenes, that sort of thing. But mostly it was pretty accurate to the finale. So you can see here, they pretty accurately did the beginning of the season and the end of the season. But it was definitely the middle section that was the challenging part from them. In terms of the original, from basically episode 5 all the way up to episode 17, they really had to adjust those episodes and try and fit, you know, the middle, like, 15, 16 episodes of the season into 4 episodes in the middle. And it was two episode kind of like two-parters here in the middle also. So interesting. Like it's functional certainly, but is it worth all of the cuts where you can see like we don't have any of imprisoned like at all basically. Waterbending scroll, we hit some of the beats, but of course we don't actually do the stuff with the pirates, even though it's like referenced. Great Divide again gets a reference, but it's not featured anywhere in the book. The Fortune Teller's basically not featured at all, and then the Deserter probably most notably isn't featured. So no Zhang Zhang here, which is a bit of an interesting choice. And then like of the characters they've kind of cut out here, you're kind of like, Zhang Zhang probably is the one where you kind of feel like they'll probably try and include him somewhere, won't they? But they've missed an opportunity now. Like, does the impact of Zhang Zhang being the one who trained Zhao initially have as much impact with Zhao already dealt with? You know, that's an interesting point. But then we get into season 2. So let's just look at the original and sort of the breakdown. Of course, it's 20 episodes long, but I immediately, in reference to what I just did there, I will highlight the first 9 as here are your problem episodes for them to adapt book 2 that people I think are very making the point quite clearly, and I agree with it to a certain extent that I think they will have an easier time adapting book 2, but there are still problem areas, and one of them is that the opening half effectively of book 2 has some of the elements of the middle of book 1. So actually, you'll note here that we don't necessarily, in our early episodes, have a super clear, amazing plot premiere kind of for season 2, in the same way that we do for season 1 and season 2. So it's going to be a little bit of a challenge about where to start. And then depending on how you do that, you know, you're going to have to kind of cut a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of jumping from place to place, which they don't seem to like in Netflix Avatar. So new place, we basically have 2 episodes in or around Omashu, then we're in the swamp, then we go back to like Kyoshi/Chin village here, then we're with Toph here, Zuko's in focus in this episode in a different location, then we're moving around the place quite a lot, then we're focused on training, and it's like boom, 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 nearly all of these episodes in a completely different location. Like there's no way there's not going to be major cuts and changes along the lines of these kind of middle episodes. So some of this stuff is definitely going to have to happen in terms of like you would say probably the early 1, 2, 3 episodes of season 2. Certainly once they hit 210 and the plot properly kicks into gear, that's when I think they're going to be like at their best. They know that they're probably going to have 4, maybe 5 episodes to cover all of this stuff that is basically just over half of the book. And this is your kind of plot lead into Ba Sing Se. And then I think Ba Sing Se is where people are, of course, expecting them to just do really good stuff with the really strong material that is the Ba Sing Se plot. Because we're in one location, all the characters are here. We know they can do the locations and make them look really good. And so can you actually bring your cast together to create the amazing ending of book 2? And I think people believe that they can, taking on feedback from season 1. There are still points of like, if you're adapting this, and I'm going with the idea here as we go through this, that we will only have 8 episodes. We don't know that that is the case for sure. When they announced the renewal for season 2 and 3 of Netflix Avatar, they didn't say how many episodes it's going to be. But if we assume they're going to keep it roughly the same, which I think is probably the fair assumption to make at this point, 8 episodes, cuts are going to have to be made. There's no way they're going to be able to, I think, touch on everything as we go through this. And so there's obvious cuts and less obvious cuts. Like, I know when I mentioned it on stream that they probably will potentially have to cut the drill, a lot of people disagreed with me and they were like, no, you can't cut the drill. But at the same time, it's like, really big CG action set piece right before you jump into your big conspiracy plot. I think they probably will want to save their budget to just have Ba Sing Se kind of throughout the episodes look as amazing as it possibly can, and then deliver on your big kind of finale moments. And so, you know, there's a way to do, in essence, the drill without having it be as big of a set piece type moment. I would equate this sort of similarly to 117 being done in exactly the way 117 was in the original, in terms of that giant battle up the mountain right before the finale. They were never going to do that, and I think the drill, unfortunately, is in a bit of a similar position to that. But anyway, before we jump into addressing what will be in each of the episodes, we do have to kind of acknowledge that the gap between seasons is going to have to be done differently here because of the way they've done season 1, and it was like filmed years ago, and now it's going to take them probably the next year or so to build up to filming for the next time. The actors are going to be clearly older. Like, it's clearly going to be the case. Like, Gordon especially is going to look much older when we start filming for season 2. So they have to address the idea that there is going to be some sort of a, you know, multiple year time skip. I'm guessing they'll go with probably 3-year time skip, but they might do more depending on how it ends up working out. So that's kind of very different. And then you also have to factor in how they did the ending of season 1, where the suggestion was that they are not planning to stay in the north and train, that it seems like they're just gonna help, I guess, out with some of the repairs to the tribe, and then they're going to head on their way. That Katara is going to train Aang, and they're just going to get back on their journey, because they're immediately sort of talking about, like, we'll start training, then we'll go to Amashu. Doesn't seem like they're going to the north, because, like, when Paku gave her the Spirit Oasis water, it's like, this is an invitation to return whenever you want, as if, like, you are leaving shortly, basically. So that would suggest that the group goes back on their travels again, and as they travel around the place, they're going to do the training. Now, again, this is happening off screen, is my assumption, of course, because you have to have a time skip. So I'm assuming most of the waterbending training just happens off screen, and obviously it's going to be under Katara. We'll likely, you know, when we jump into episodes, I guess, see Katara and Aang training waterbending in the same way we saw Katara doing training kind of on her own in the various episodes of season 1. So you could still highlight this, but very much so I'm getting the impression that, like, yeah, this is just going to be in between seasons. Aang now has another element, and then we go on to, of course, he needs an earthbending master, setting up the plot at the start here. The other point that would come into play definitely is if it is like 2 or 3 years, it feels like it's an absolute impossibility that the gang never finds out ahead of time that Omashu has fallen. This should be a world event after a couple of days, weeks, and they can't really do this in the same way they did the original. Now, they could still absolutely want to go to Omashu to maybe try and get Bumi out if he's still in there, or just try and take back Omashu or something like that, but there is absolutely the option that they just decide that because of the time skip style stuff, Omashu is kind of off limits, we can't really go there. So maybe return to Omashu doesn't necessarily happen in the way we kind of think it does. Some other stuff comes up in terms of, like, say, like Ty Lee and where she is positioned in terms of, you know, she was with Azula, but now there's going to be a couple of years gap. Notably, of course, when she took Omashu, they didn't show May and Ty Lee with her. So Azula forming her team would still have to happen. Now, of course, the idea is, as usual, I guess, May's family will be put in charge of Omashu, so that explains May. But will they give Ty Lee her circus arc? Probably have to properly introduce these characters at the start of season 2. I know a lot of people have issues with the way that they were kind of characterized, just because they were just there to talk to Azula once or twice. Like, they weren't even named in the scenes that they were in. Again, nothing on the actors and how they did their performances. It was just the usage of the characters in the writing, and they didn't do enough with them, basically. So, jumping into how they're actually going to do this. This is immediately an issue. what do they do for the first episode? Because you don't have the big bombastic thing like you did at the start of episode 1 of season 1, where you don't really have a big history kind of lesson to jump in on here, and you don't have the immediate, this is the intro to the show that The Boy in the Iceberg is. The Avatar state works as an opener in the original, because we hadn't really addressed the Avatar state up to this point. But Aang already knows what the Avatar state is here. The only thing he doesn't know is that dying in the Avatar state ends the cycle. So you assume that's going to have to get brought up at some point, given what the likely, canonical finale is going to be in terms of Aang nearly dying in the Avatar state, the whole situation at the end there, being revived by the spirit water. So this has to get brought up at some point, but does that mean that we have to do the opening episode as the group goes to an Earth Kingdom fortress and General Fong asks Aang to use the Avatar state and attack the Fire Nation? I'm not sure that that's necessarily the correct approach to have. And so, it's not the most plot-focused premiere episode compared to The Boy in the Iceberg and The Awakening for season 3. So, what is this actually going to be? Because then you go to episode 2 and, well, the Cave of Two Lovers is already covered. If we do go to Omashu, we can say that, hey, we can get into the palace to potentially get Bumi out if we go through the caves, but we're not going to redo the whole thing again. So this is basically covered outside of maybe a reference. So this then brings up the idea, so does this mean we actually maybe open up with Return to Omashu as a way to potentially get Bumi to teach Aang earthbending? Because you sort of maybe need that in terms of Bumi is the one who tells Aang that he needs an earthbending teacher who uses neutral Jing, basically, who waits and listens before striking. So do we need to do that setup here, or can we just introduce Toph when required, basically? So to me, I do feel that probably starting with Omashu is maybe the way to go, because they focused so much on Omashu in the in season 1, and it would make sense if you have the kind of CG models in place and stuff like that. You spend so much time there, why not go back? But at the same time, does it logically make sense for the group to go there when they're going to immediately know what has happened here? And then, because it has been multiple years, is Bumi actually being kept in Omashu all this time? Or will they change up like where he is? Because you kind of need Bumi in position to do his stuff like during the eclipse that we learn about in the kind of finale. But again, they don't have to do things in that exact way. So I don't know. I think maybe to just not complicate things, I guess Bumi maybe just has to be held prisoner in his own city. And this probably still does make sense to be the opener here. As Mei's family being installed as the kind of leaders of New Ozai, Azula then getting in touch with Mei again, finding Zuko. But then you also have the issue of, like, you kind of have to do so many introductions for Azula quite early on in this show. So, like, in episode 1, do we focus on her going after Zuko and Iroh? Or is it encountering Team Avatar that kind of needs to be what happens first with her? Can they do both those in the exact same episode? Potentially. But we're not entirely sure. Like, they could have a situation where Zuko and Iroh maybe hang out in Omashu, New Ozai. That would be maybe a little bit like convenient to have everyone together, but you have to think about these things. If we potentially don't even start with Omashu, like we're skipping everything early on, perhaps a return to Kyoshi Island to tackle bits of 205 Avatar Day is an option. This would certainly be good setup for Suki, because you have a better idea in the live action version of where Suki gets used and not used. Like them going back and having to meet Yukari, and Yukari be like, oh, like shortly after you left, she went out on her own, like to participate in the war and stuff like that. That would be a kind of cool thing, and it then gives Aang an option to speak to Kyoshi and maybe find out about the whole end of the cycle if you die in the Avatar state situation. And it feels like stuff like this is kind of stuff that they maybe quickly will be able to do, of just like, well, we focused on Kyoshi for a whole episode, so why don't we go back there temporarily? Because it is in the original that they go back there, but do we need to have the whole Chin Village kind of comedy stuff and just messing around there with Aang in prison while we do the whole investigation thing? It's probably not the time for that, but incorporating it in as a little bit of an episode, you can see how that could actually work. And And then the final option for the first episode is just that they could get surprisingly aggressive and perhaps have Toph's introduction be in the opener. But I do think you need at least one episode to kind of get us up to speed first on what's happened, especially because you're going to have some sort of a time skip. I think Toph would be excessive in the first episode. So then jumping ahead, in episode 2, if you don't have Toph in the opener, then I do feel you kind of have to get her in immediately here. If they follow the same format as season 1, then we're kind of thinking of these episodes as basically like groups of 2. So this will be the second part of our kind of opener 2-parter, and it feels like you probably have to get Toph into play early on. Again, going back to sort of the episodes we have around here, you could see, like, is this overly suited to being the first episode? Potentially, depending how they do it. Cave of Two Lovers is getting cut, of course. Will they do Omashu? They could. It's certainly an easy way to bring everyone together. It probably likely will be what they do, but we have to wait and see. The Swamp, have they not already maybe done elements of this with how they did episode 5 of Netflix Avatar by having the 3 characters in the spirit world all have a bit of a spirit encounter? Will they do that again? But then the Banyan Grove tree, Hudu, though, are cool, but is there the time to randomly go to the swamp to do all of this? That's the problem that we're going to have here, is can we go to Omashu, Kyoshi, and the swamp all within the space of like an episode or 2? They don't have the ability to do that, as shown by how they did season 1. They were very selective about their locations, including taking characters out of the location they're typically in and putting them in other locations. So they seem to want to avoid excessive amounts of traveling, so what do they actually do here? And obviously you can see Toph only gets introduced properly in the 6th episode after the first full quarter of the season is kind of done with. So, you know, we're getting through it quite quickly, but this is the way it kind of has to be done, because the plot focused stuff that's in the second half of the season is going to need at least 4, but probably more like 5 episodes to give it the attention that it needs. So it does give us only 3 episodes realistically to cover the first like 9 episodes probably. So you have to give excessive focus to Toph's introduction. This has to be big. This is probably your most important casting decision after the main characters. Now that you're done with season 1, Toph is the character you now need to get right. And it is going to be interesting because post time skip, are we looking for like a 15-year-old Toph, not a 12-year-old Toph? That's the whole idea if we're trying to match up the age kind of ratings and stuff like that of the characters. So they need to get this right in terms of someone who can perform the role physically, but it's also she is such a character. Like you need to have the actress able to get that aspect of Toph across. Major challenge for them here. Like I wouldn't be surprised if there's huge amounts of time and effort going into finding Toph, and it's probably going to be so much more challenging than almost any other character they have to introduce in this season. Your likes of like Long Fangs, Ursa's, and all these other characters. Like this is key. But then yeah, like when you do this, it feels just like, yeah, you basically just need to do the Blind Bandit in full. Like, I just don't see any way around this, because people will, I think, be annoyed if you overly changed such a key episode. And that's why I think they know to keep certain stuff accurate, like they did with, say, like Zuko's backstory, and a lot of the kind of Zuko-focused stuff, they kept it pretty much the same. And I think the expectation would be there for the Blind Bandit, that if you're not doing this where, you know, she does effectively work for a earthbending wrestling promotion, and if you don't actually cover Earth Rumble, people will be, I think, pretty annoyed. Do you need to have as many Earth Rumble characters as they had in the original? Perhaps not. But I think at the very least, you probably need like the Boulder, the Hippo, and kind of like 1 or 2 others. Like you need your Zinfus, of course, I guess. So that's all relatively fine. Like, again, there's room for expansion here, because like I'm assuming you probably want to go a little bit more in depth on like her parents, her relationship with them, especially if their character is going to be slightly older here at this kind of time of introduction. Delving into her backstory a little bit more, filling out stuff on exactly how she came to join Earth Rumble would be kind of interesting. Maybe you actually do her backstory with the Badger Moles, you tell that as well. That would be kind of cool. And then other than that, it's like, do you give an entire episode just to Toph? You probably do have to have some Zuko stuff in here. So obviously it's going to be the Zuko Iroh stuff on the run, and you've probably done some of that in the opening episode with like Azula and them encountering her. But here you probably have to get more across the idea of him exploring the Earth Kingdom, finding out what his new kind of path is, what is his destiny meant to be. And the big thing for Zuko, of course, early on is Zuko Alone, the Zuko Alone backstory. And it does feel like you either have to just choose an episode to do it, and having it be alongside the Blind Bandit would be kind of cool. But there's also, I think, room for it to happen at roughly any other time. But it's a really important backstory here because of the amount of characters that are going to be involved here. Because this is the one where, like, it's basically the introduction of Ursa, Azulon, and what happened to Azulon, how Ozai got the throne, and why it wasn't given to Iroh. All of these points get explained here. And they have stuff from the search to potentially add into it to maybe do something a little bit more. Because we're all wondering, like, are they going to actually maybe try to tackle the what happened to Ursa plot? Because they talked about the Mother of Faces in season 1, and that's from the same comic. So you assume more of this stuff will come out here, but some of that stuff requires actual Ursa to be involved here. So you're almost like, is there any way for them to have Ursa kind of come into contact with Zuko earlier on in the story to do this? But we don't really know. But that the Zuko Alone backstory is certainly key to do at some point. But yeah, I think you need to give pretty much the full episode 2, probably to the Blind Bandit, if not a little bit more. Going to episode 3, I think you need to have an episode post Toph's introduction for her to just be kind of with the group and get some characterization, and not jump straight into the plot focused stuff of the library. So I think you need to do some of like bitter work for the training that happens with Zuko and also Aang. And then also the Zuko Alone backstory would kind of be nice to pair up with the Zuko Alone. So maybe we set up the start of backstories here, we do it a lot more heavily here. But then you also need to keep Azula in play. So do you try and bring some of the chase in here as well? So this is the point here of like, this episode has to be some weird combination of episode 7, 8, and 9 probably. Or else you just drop some of that stuff and create like a new original kind of scenario. But I think you certainly want to have maybe that Azula encounter where like it's everyone confronting Azula, the big standoff scene eventually. Before we jump into the plot stuff for basically the second half of the book. Because, at least in my opinion, I feel by the time we get to episode 4, so with 5 episodes to go, we have to be jumping into more of the direct plot. So here's where I think we need to kick things into gear. This is where the library and I think also the desert has to happen. And if not, I think we're stretching things out too much, and I would worry about stuff being overly rushed towards the second half, towards the end of the show. So yeah, what needs to happen, of course, with the library is, of course, that the gang have to learn about the eclipse and potentially also the comet to create urgency within the story. Because if we're going to jump ahead with the idea that like they've spent maybe 3 years traveling together with Aang training waterbending or whatever, you're going to need to explain why suddenly we need to be more direct in what we're doing, preparing for something. Whereas, you know, post Aang getting the vision from Kyoshi about what's going to happen in the north, he doesn't necessarily know that there's any obvious kind of threat coming particularly soon. So I'm wondering if they do stuff like that as we go forward. Like, does one of the other past avatars like tell him that, oh, the comet's coming soon? Or is it the library where we actually get this? Because it would make sense. We ended the first season with the great sage showing Ozai that they seem to know the comet is coming soon. And the gang then also need to learn about this stuff. At least to me, I feel you can't completely cut the desert. I understand how you would maybe want to make it a little bit shorter, a little bit more compressed. And you could even do that across both episodes, like the build up to us getting to the library. Like, we can learn about the library in a earlier episode potentially and be told that that's where we need to go next. But I think we need some of the character stuff that happens in the desert for sure, because of course Toph needs to make her big choice. Appa has to be taken. I feel that is something that is going to have to happen, because it feels like it's so important to what happens to Aang in the book, and this kind of in a way also setting up Katara needing to step up across these episodes to kind of keep the group together. And for Katara especially, she needs this arc. This is good Katara stuff in the original, and it needs to be good here in the live action version also. Of course, at around this time, the Order of the White Lotus probably needs to be properly introduced. And again, we have a little bit of setup with that from the original, from season 1, because of course, Iroh had a White Lotus tile, of course. But then, of course, this is where we then make the decision of like, okay, we're basically in the episodes that are directly setting us up, arriving at Ba Sing Se. How many episodes are we actually giving directly to Ba Sing Se, or are we spending a lot more time getting there? There's an arc to get there, and then there's an arc when we get there. And this is one of the other big questions they're going to have to ask. Because otherwise you think that like, the desert might need a little bit more time. So this episode could be the desert flowing into the Serpent's Pass, because you need to, I think, give Suki some focus, because I think Suki in live action was very well received. So they're going to want to make a bigger deal out of Suki. So either Suki is going to have to just be in more episodes and maybe be with the group for a longer period of time, or gets introduced in the Serpent's Pass and they actually give it the time and development that it needs, with her addressing maybe her backstory, kind of being inspired by meeting them for the first time to come out and join the war. Also, of course, Katara helping Aang to kind of get his hope back over this episode feels kind of important as well. And, you know, because we didn't do too much. Because we didn't do too much with the animals, like actually maybe introducing the serpent could be a bit of an interesting set piece scene. But this is an episode that maybe feels like you maybe have to make a decision when it comes to like the Serpent's Pass and the drill of like, are you going to do both of these things? Like a big set piece scene that's going to require this location, the Serpent's Pass, plus a giant animal, or are you going to devote a lot of time and attention to the introduction of the drill, which is also going to create its own kind of maybe like CG problems or issues. That's a big question. And then there's also the sense of just, do they really cut these episodes down? But there's still a certain amount of traveling that is going to happen, where like if we're in the library and we're in the desert, we have to then get to Ba Sing Se, of course. So, you know, we also have to keep in mind Azula still has to be doing stuff in a book where she's in much more focus, so we have to set that up as well. And again, because the changes made in season 1, like the balloons and stuff like that, air power for the Fire Nation is in play a little bit earlier. We can maybe change some of this stuff. Like, why do we need the drill when we have war balloons? And that's a new thing that the Earth Kingdom doesn't really know how to deal with. So you could change the drill to be a bit of an air power action set piece. And that could be kind of interesting. So yeah, then we're getting into the final 3 episodes. This is where it feels like it is the kind of bare minimum to cover the Ba Sing Se end of season arc. So to me, you have to at this point jump into City of Walls and Secrets, so 214 here. Likely expand it out, because we have to bring up the discussion here. What are they going to do about Tales of Ba Sing Se and also Appa's Lost Days? Because I think, unfortunately, they are 2 uniquely formatted episodes that are, I think, just too different compared to the way Netflix is going to have to do things. So I do think you effectively are going to have to cut out most of 215, likely keeping select moments and rolling them into kind of City of Walls and Secrets, kind of introducing Ba Sing Se to us. So, for instance, you know, the big one, the Iroh Lu Ten moment, it does feel like, to a certain degree, we've already touched on the kind of intent of that scene with the funeral scene from season 1. So do we need to have this one here? Well, we might have another reference, of course. That would be definitely nice for Iroh to, again, celebrate like Lu Ten's birthday, basically, like what happens here. But a lot of the rest of the plots of City of Walls and Secrets, like Aang and the animals, Sokka and the poetry, that sort of stuff, I just don't see them having the time to do a lot of that stuff, where like if they skipped over so many relatively key episodes in like season 1, I just think this one is getting heavily cut down, if not nearly completely gone. and they'll just slightly expand out City of Walls and Secrets, is my thoughts. There's obviously room for expansion with Long Feng in terms of more the backstory of like how did he get into such a position more exactly. King Kuei, doing more on that side of things if you really want to, like really lean into the idea of you have a detailed plot here with the conspiracy within the walls, the Dai Li and all this sort of stuff. Like it'd be actually kind of cool if we found some way to like bring up at this point the whole idea that Kyoshi created the Dai Li in or around this time. That would add some drama to it, certainly. And of course, we fully expect Jet to still maintain his Bossing Say arc here. So him interacting with Zuko and everything that happens there with the brainwashing. We need to see one of our characters get brainwashed. So I think Jet, it has to be here for sure. And then Appa's Lost Days is again one of these things where like a lot of people really value this episode, but unfortunately for CG budget reasons and also just time constraints, I don't think they're going to give like half an episode to just Appa on his own, and I just don't think they have the resources to do that. Look how much they used or didn't use Appa in season 1. You can't give it massive focus, but you can't ignore it either. I think the Appa gets kidnapped plot has to happen, because I think you have to create the arc for Aang and everything that happens there, and certain key scenes, like for instance the positioning of Suki within the series, and then Azula, infiltrating as a Kyoshi warrior. This needs to happen. So I can see them showing this from like Suki and or like Azula's perspective to highlight that these characters are doing this. But again, a lot of this depends on where Suki is introduced, and then does she leave the group again, and how you make these scenes actually happen. Maybe we could also see Appa meeting Guru Pathik, but I can see them also making the decision to just be like, no, Aang, when he arrives there, that's just as good of an opportunity to introduce Guru Pathik as doing it with Pathik meeting Appa, basically. Then into episode 7, where we're at the point now where this one, of course, is basically 214, likely with bits of 215 and 216 included. Then we pretty much have to be straight into either some combination of like additional bits of like 216, but mainly like Laogai 217 has to be here. But then also the Earth King has to be included here as well. And maybe the Earth King, I can see them cutting down some of this stuff of like, do we need some of these action set pieces here? But like Zuko's arc at this point is quite important. But I can also see them maybe holding back some of the backstory stuff to happen during this kind of basically Zuko makes himself sick arc type thing. So this might be a decent point to bring up some of the core points from the backstory. But otherwise, like we're definitely in this sort of position here, like the end of season 1, where it's like, okay, you're just in a position now where you just need to, as accurately as possible, time manage yourself through these episodes to hit the main beat that you have to. And then obviously like 208 is obviously going to have to be the Guru and Crossroads of Destiny. And again, there's an opportunity depending on what way they do it. Like maybe like Laogai ends up being a big part of this episode, and we covered that much earlier. Maybe the Earth King gets to kind of be a big centerpiece episode, just maybe a little bit on its own. Maybe the Earth King and the Guru get grouped together. Maybe Crossroads gets its own episode on its own right at the end. It depends on how exactly all this stuff comes together. Because like there's going to be a little bit of traveling that happens here, because Aang's going to go to the Eastern Air Temple. Sokka has to go meet up with his father. Katara stays in the city, and there's a lot of like moving pieces as we kind of go through all of this stuff. But we would expect it to be relatively accurate here, because especially if they are going to film back to back, then there's no real need to change up the ending of the season like they did with season 1 a little bit, where we just need to set the obvious stuff up of like Zuko has kind of betrayed everyone. He's going back to the Fire Nation, a hero, having helped. And Katara has brought Aang back from the dead, basically, with the Spirit Water. But it is a loss for our heroes going into the final season. So, to me, that's effectively how you're going to have to do it. Again, the core points being that in terms of the adaptation, again, first 9 episodes is going to be a challenge. You devote maybe 3 episodes to cover effectively all of this. and it's like there's complexities around Omashu, so what is that first episode? But then there's also the time skip that you're probably going to need to fill us in on, because things are being done a little bit differently because of the filming, timing stuff. The Blind Bandit, Toph's introduction is going to have to be a big centerpiece, but how big or how changed, altered is this going to be? How do they distribute the Zuko alone flashbacks out across the season? And then stuff like, Avatar State, the Swamp, Avatar Day, the Chase, Bitter Work. You need to feature bits and pieces of these episodes, but you kind of maybe don't have the time to just stop and do this whole thing. So how is this all going to happen? I think it gets a little bit easier as you go into this. The big thing is, obviously, I think by the time we get to the library, we have enough episodes to get through all of this. But then there's the other point, which is that if they do give them more episodes, like even one more episode, I think would be such a pressure release valve for the kind of series to just have a little bit more space to work with. If they gave them 10, I think that would be absolutely ideal and a major improvement. That way they can actually, they have time to maybe do some of this stuff. Whereas otherwise you feel they kind of have to rush to get to the much more important stuff. If they have 10 episodes, then maybe we can actually do a little bit more of these two. Maybe we have time for another set piece action scene when maybe otherwise we wouldn't. Because certainly, looking a little bit ahead to season 3, I can't really picture a way to do it in 8 episodes without it feeling incredibly rushed. They are going to need at least another episode for the final season, because it's 21 episodes. The original is another episode, so they need more time, and I hope they give them a little bit more, especially for the final season. But that's the kind of big thing here, is just, there's some questions. It's going to be tricky for the opening episodes, but it should get better for them for like the second half of the series especially. There's still some maneuvering to do, just because we do have some weirdly formatted episodes in 215 and 216, of course. But once they give themselves enough time, I think we're going to be in a pretty good position here. And otherwise, I think the big things to get right are just improve the way you do character arcs for these characters, and that being just like, don't feel that you have to set up that this is what Aang is dealing with this book, and every single episode we have to hit home that point, every single point. That's not how the original does it. That's not really how Avatar in general kind of does its character arc. It's more like there are key episodes over the course of a season where we will come back to the character arc and do something with it. Trying to make it a thing where something happens with it every single episode isn't necessarily the case, because sometimes in Avatar it's just the character is just being themselves in this episode, building up to the next big point in their journey. That's the kind of whole point of kind of doing things here, and they just need to be able to let some of the characters kind of breathe, just be themselves for times when they're required, but then let other characters kind of jump into the spotlight when required. Like when the desert comes around, let Katara naturally come to the forefront as the character who would naturally take up a leadership role in this position. When Aang is struggling in the aftermath of losing Appa, let Katara come to the forefront to help Aang through this. That whole sort of idea. If we do the drill, let Sokka come to the forefront with the planning, those type of situations. Don't be super focused on the idea we need to be serialized and we need to do character arcs, because I think people are in agreement that it was at times a bit repetitive with some of the characters in season 1, how they approached doing it, where they focused more on the idea of character development rather than just, in a way, exploring the character, letting the character just have screen time where they get to be themselves and showing you the different sides of themselves. That's the kind of the point here. And you would hope that, like with the introduction of Toph, they can really see what they need to do there, have everything planned out, and it work well. Because I think we're relatively confident about stuff like Zuko's arc coming together nicely, because they did that really well in season 1. It's just more of like, will Katara be improved in season 2? That's another kind of a big talking point, because there's a lot of stuff that I'd be very confident about, like visuals, locations, costuming. very confident. It's just that writing kind of element that just needs to come up a few notches to get this series to the place where I think it needs to be. But in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are. How do you think they're going to do season 2? What are your thoughts on my breakdown of like where the challenge pain points are going to be? How do you think they're going to do especially the early parts of book 2? How many episodes is Ba Sing Se going to get? Where are the cuts going to be? Potential additions and all this sort of stuff. What are you expecting them to do with season 2 for Netflix Avatar? But that has been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.